Hey internets, time for a quick rant. There's this really common but also really annoying reasoning mistake I keep seeing a lot of people making, especially a lot of political influencers and ideologues out there, when trying to explain the reason for a problem. And this reasoning error is something I like to call initial hindrance. It can be best understood as sort of a combination of the anchoring bias and the availability heuristic. Anchoring being people's tendency to take the very first piece of information that they hear, and then they use that very first piece of information to influence how they think about all the other information, even though that doesn't really make sense because there's nothing actually special about the first thing you hear if you think about it rationally. For instance, if you're negotiating the price of a new house, why would the first price you hear be the one that you'd want to base all of your decisions on? Especially if that very first price is completely and ridiculously inaccurate in comparison to the rest of the housing market in your area. And yet a lot of people often do just base their decisions on the first thing that they hear. And then the availability heuristic is when people tend to judge things based on what most easily springs to mind. And the result of this is initial hindrance. People's tendency to blame problems on the very first thing that gives them any kind of pushback, any kind of resistance, or anything that otherwise hinders their plans of what they're trying to do. For instance, say some random toid is running down the street for no real apparent reason, and he smacks himself face first into a wall, and what he does is he then starts blaming the wall. He gets up and he starts punching the wall. Darn this wall for existing. How dare you get in my way? When of course there was an additional pathway he could have taken that didn't involve him running into a wall. So the actual cause of his problems is just his own poor navigation skills. In other words, initial hindrance is caused by people not really thinking through what is actually causing the problem. And they instead just kind of blame it on what most easily comes to their mind based on the first information that they get. And then they just kind of anchor their mind on that bias. Now, it's pretty obviously a wrong way of thinking when you think about it in terms of some invalid running headfirst into a wall and not being able to comprehend that it's not the wall's fault. But surprisingly, a lot of people on both the left and the right tend to screw this up when talking about more complex topics than just a wall in the way. For instance, the most common leftoid example of initial hindrance would be rent is theft. Basically, no one likes having to pay for housing because, well, it's expensive, and so the landlord comes along and demands rental payment from his rentoids, and because the landlord is providing the first initial resistance or the initial hindrance to their desire to not have to pay so much for housing, they conclude that it's all the landlord's fault, because again, he's the first one to give them any kind of pushback. But of course, that's not what's really going on. If you ask why so many landlords are charging so much, you find out it's because the housing market is broken. And when you investigate why the housing market is broken, you'll find out it's broken due to artificial barriers and zoning restrictions the state has put in place. And you also find out that part of the reason they are doing that is to intentionally inflate the value of housing investments at the expense of everybody else. And so the real cause is actually just government corruption, resulting in ineffective policy. But the leftist doesn't investigate any of that. He gets stuck. He anchors himself on landlord is to blame, and he doesn't investigate further in that, which is basically what initial hindrance is. It's someone refusing to do actual serious investigation on the why behind the why behind the why until they actually find someone that is legitimately doing something evil. So they blame the first thing that they run into rather than trying to actually understand what's going on. And then thanks to the anchoring bias, they will then generate thousands of economically illiterate, dumb arguments for why it's the landlord's fault, which is very silly because a lot of times the landlord is actually one of the people who are working against the housing market being crappy. For instance, say some boomer builds a house for himself, and then he moves out and then rents the house to you. Not only is the boomer not at fault for the rent you're paying, but he actually contributed to the housing market for building that house in the first place. So blaming him is really, really, really stupid. But in the mind of someone who's stuck on that initial hindrance, they'll blame him because he's the first person asking them for any kind of money, and they're not trying to understand how the economy works as a whole. They're not trying to understand the ins and outs of the housing market. It's this really basic rudimentary thinking of this guy wants money, I don't want to give it to him, therefore this guy is at fault for my problems. Now on the flip side, I do see a lot of people leaning to the right who will make this reasoning error as well, especially conservative liberals, specifically on the topic of wokeness. A lot of times the classical liberals, they'll blame wokeness on just whatever piece of media that they're hating on for the day. And while a lot of times those takes can be funny, and admittedly it is kind of fun to watch them take a dump on Disney and Hollywood and whatnot for pushing out woke garbage, they'll often make the mistake of blaming Hollywood and Disney for the very existence of wokeness itself. Because, well, it's the initial hindrance. They're the one that put out the woke garbage, therefore wokeness is their fault. But of course, that's not actually true. They're not asking the deeper question of where did the media get this ideology from, at which point you find out that it comes from a lot of Marxist academics. And then you ask yourself the question further of, well, how did these people actually have any kind of power to push this garbage ideology if it doesn't actually make sense? And then behind that, you find out that there are a lot of laws and liberalism that a lot of conservatives are misguidedly proud of that actually enable the woke behavior we see. For example, thinking that civil rights good, and everybody being allowed to vote good, and privileging victimhood good, allowing the plebs to vote for whatever they want as a new right, even if that alleged right contradicts property rights, good. Which is very unfortunate, because none of those things are good. If these rhinos actually thought about it, they would realize that by them accepting these falsehoods as true, it's actually giving these leftist academics the ammo they need to push their woke ideology. And that's why it's so important to not just blame things on what first seems to appear in front of your face. More often than not, there's a lot more going on behind the scenes. And that failing to notice this causes people to miss the real solution to their problems. Anyways, that's all for now. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to like, comment, subscribe. Till next time.